Hello and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Allison Gampel and serve as the Associate Director of Alumni Programs here at York University. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture that's titled Sustainability, Pathways to Decarbonization and the Future of Ontario's Energy Systems, which will be presented by Dr. Mark Winfield, who is a professor in our Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, is the Sustainability Energy Initiative Co-Chair, MES, and the MES JD Program Coordinator. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I'm on. Because we may not be gathered in the same place, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you are on. Please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. If you wish to understand more about the background of York University's land acknowledgement, please do feel free to watch the excellent Scholars Hub session that was presented by Dr. Ruth Green on March 20th of this year. Now, we'd like to conduct a quick poll before each session begins. The question that will appear today is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll should pop up on your screen right now, and I'll give everyone a moment to respond. Okay, the poll has popped up. So, how knowledgeable are you about the topic of today's presentation? Thank you so much. It's very helpful for our speakers to know more about who's in our audience and what knowledge you're coming in with. Many of us are very familiar with Zoom, but still, if you need any help, please do feel free to click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and enter your question. We've got a team ready to help you. And that same button can be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period that will follow his presentation. Please do note that all of your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and to our staff working behind the scenes. We ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. At this point, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Winfield. Dr. Mark Winfield is a professor of environmental and urban change here at York University. He's also the co-chair of the Faculty Sustainable Energy Initiative, coordinator of the Master of Environmental Studies, MES, and joint MES Juris Doctor program that's offered in conjunction with Osgoode Law School. As well, he serves as a member of the York University Senate. He has published articles, book chapters, and reports on a wide range of climate change, environment, and energy law and policy topics. We are so pleased that you could make the time to join us today. Welcome, Dr. Winfield. Right, I see him coming on.
There we go.
Hello and welcome.
There we go. Thank you, Allison. I'm going to go into a screen share, and we will proceed from there. And we will go from the beginning. So welcome, everyone. And this is sort of an update on some previous discussions, but this is an area where there is a lot going on. So I'm going to provide a little bit of background in terms of how did we get to where we are, and then some discussion of where we are might actually be. The electricity and energy system in Ontario is a very interesting case study in the sense that there's sort of longstanding tensions between distributed versus centralized pathways, and we'll see some of that coming up in the current debates. This is a convergence point for debates around climate change, decarbonization, electrification, and sustainability. And then there are a lot of it's sort of technological choices embedded here as well around the future role of nuclear, natural gas, renewable energy, energy storage, distributed energy resources, demand side measures, including energy efficiency and demand response, and then Ontario's relationships with neighboring jurisdictions. And we'll see a sort of intersection between all of these things going on in this story. It is useful to understand it in the context of the past as well, that for the first 90 years, we went through a period of relative stability around electricity, especially through the Ontario Hydroelectric Commission and then Ontario Hydro. This was a Crown-owned, vertically integrated monopoly that built and owned virtually all of the generating assets, hydro, coal, nuclear, built and owned the provincial transmission grid, and provided electricity distribution services in rural areas. By comparison, the past 30 years or so have been a period of enormous disruption, and we're still sort of dealing with the fallout within the sector. Ontario Hydro effectively collapsed in the mid-1990s as a result of a massive overbuilding of supply. The estimates were it was $38 billion in debt at the point that it was broken up. It had become apparent that there was no effective regulatory oversight or indeed control over Ontario Hydro, and its reputation for technological competence had collapsed, particularly through something called the Nuclear Asset Optimization Plan, where essentially the oldest reactors at Pickering and Bruce had to be taken out of service virtually overnight because of both maintenance and operating problems. And that sort of set the stage for the breakup of Ontario Hydro in the late 90s. We have the successor corporations, which are still with us, and they will come up in the conversation. So Ontario Power Generation essentially ended up with Ontario Hydro's nuclear, coal, and hydro generating assets. It's a provincially owned Crown Corporation. Hydro One took over the provincial transmission system and rural distribution services. This was also a Crown Corporation, but is now partially privatized. And then there was an independent market operator, what's now called the Independent Electricity System Operator, which was charged with the sort of day, minute by minute, really sort of matching of demand and supply in the system, but also sort of has a planning mandate, maybe. There is some confusion around that. It is useful to think about all this in terms of how the mix of technologies being used to provide electricity has evolved over time. And crucially interesting here is that up to about 1960, the system was essentially 100% hydroelectric. It was described and gravity fed. It's been described as the perfect renewable energy system. The problem was that from the late 50s onwards, electricity demand in Ontario began to outstrip the readily available supply of hydro sites. So first we began to build fossil generation, coal, and then between the 1960s and the 90s, we embarked on this massive nuclear construction project, building the Pickering, Darlington, and Bruce facilities to the point where in the mid-90s, the system was 60% nuclear in terms of energy output. Of course, that huge nuclear expansion was also tied up with the enormous debt that eventually sank Ontario Hydro. The Nuclear Asset Optimization Plan I mentioned led to a very dramatic rise in the role of coal-fired generation, which had almost been retired. And that set in motion a series of events that led to the phase out of coal-fired electricity between the 2000 and 2010, basically over a space of 10 years. We went from a situation where coal was providing 25% of the electricity supply in Ontario in 2003 to, as of the end of 2013, it was zero. This is often presented as the single most significant measure taken so far to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. And it did produce measurable improvements in air quality in Southern Ontario, especially. We've basically gone to smog days being a routine thing in the summer to being almost unheard of, except in light of the wildfires last summer. As part of that transition, we saw the addition of a significant portion of new renewable energy sources to the system. from a standing start of 0 over 5,000 megawatts wind and over 2,000 megawatts solar in particular, although there was also a large growth in gas-fired generation installed, although it wasn't running that much. And then some of the nuclear facility plants which were taken out of service did come back into service as well. So this is the installed capacity at the moment. If you look at the system in terms of energy output at the moment, it's a little over 50% nuclear, 25% hydro, mostly legacy assets. Renewables are accounting for about 10% at the moment. Gas also about 10%, although watch that space carefully, because one of the things that is now happening is we're seeing a very large, dramatic ramp up in the role of gas-fired generation and the role and the associated greenhouse gas emissions that go with that. The last formal plan we had for the system now dates from 7 years ago under Kathleen Wynne's government. That did commit to the refurbishment of the Darlington and Bruce nuclear facilities, to attempt to extend the life of the Pickering B plant in particular, which was supposed to close in 2018. But there was also a very strong conservation strategy. But at this stage, in the aftermath of the Green Energy Act, effectively the province was already abandoning any further significant development of renewable energy after that sort of very rapid growth in the 2010s. And then also the Wynne government did eliminate the formal requirement that there be any kind of actual system plan that was subject to some sort of external review by the Ontario Energy Board. I'll come back to that as well. The Ford government, when it arrived, part of the platform was to reduce hydro rates, because hydro rates had effectively doubled, especially or more, especially in rural areas. And Mr. Ford blamed the Green Energy Act for this. He canceled the remaining 750 odd renewable energy projects that were underway. These were mostly small scale and community owned. Cost was at least 230 million, possibly considerably more. In some cases, completed wind turbine projects were literally ripped out of the ground. The province's energy conservation strategy was terminated a year later. Almost immediately upon being elected, the climate change strategy, which was fairly comprehensive, that the Wynne government had adopted in 2017, was basically dismantled. And then the final vestiges that there be any kind of planning framework were also eliminated. So essentially, the system works now on the basis of what are called directives from the Minister of Energy. And the content of those directives are not subject to any form of review or oversight. This is effectively a paradigm of what I've termed direct political management, which you really don't see in other North American jurisdictions. The Ford government has articulated a pathway around electricity. This is the Powering Ontario's growth paper from July 2023, which in many ways sort of confirmed discussions which were already underway. The IESO had tabled a pathways to decarbonization strategy a year earlier. It was proposing a doubling of the generating capacity in the province, a very large expansion of nuclear especially, but also some renewables. But the cost of this was being put in the range of $400 billion. We'll come back to that as well. In practice, what we've seen from the Ford government is a very overwhelming focus on nuclear, and also a very, very strong focus on natural gas. There is a commitment to the ongoing refurbishment of the Darlington plant. There are now proposals for 3 new build reactors at Darlington, 300 megawatts. These would be the first new build reactor projects in Ontario initiated in 50 years. There is the ongoing refurbishment of 6 reactors at Bruce, and now a proposal for 4,800 megawatts of new capacity of undefined technology. In February, the government said it would try and refurbish the 4 reactors at Pickering B, even though that had been assessed a decade earlier as uneconomic. And then there was also both an expansion of gas-fired generation and an enormous ramp up of the existing gas plants, which had been relatively underutilized, are now beginning to run flat out. And I'll come back to that too. Although there was discussion in the pathways paper, there's been very little movement on renewables until very recently, a little bit on grid storage, some very feeble restarts on conservation and demand management. More innovative things like distributed energy resources have been limited to what are termed sandboxes or sort of very experimental spaces. After repeatedly rebuffing offers from the Premier of Quebec, there has been some minor reopening of the relationship with Quebec, but nowhere near as might have been possible. The consequence of this, and part of what now then is happening, is that as nuclear units, especially at Darlington and Bruce, are taken out of service to be refurbished over the next 2 decades, the shortfall in electricity, because we've closed the door in renewables, we've closed the door in efficiency, and we've closed the door in Quebec, is being made up by ramping up the gas plants to the point where by 2030, they will be accounting for the same portion of Ontario's electricity system as the coal plants were before they were phased out. This translates into a fairly enormous growth in greenhouse gas emissions, as well as nitrogen oxides. Basically, we're heading for about an 8-fold increase relative to the low point in 2017 towards about 18 megatons greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector in Ontario. This has significant downstream consequences too, because in effect, if we're trying to electrify, what's happening in Ontario is that the marginal fuel is natural gas. So if we're adding load because we're trying to electrify space heating or transportation, that's going to be served for the next 2 decades almost certainly by gas-fired generation, which I think is somewhat problematic. There were some sort of new developments this year. At the end of the year, there was a reopening of the door on renewables, willingness to entertain possibility of 2,000 megawatts of new supply by 2030, and then further growth out to 2034, but then also an announcement of an intention to try and refurbish the Pickering B plant, which had been scheduled to close in 2018. And this, in combination with the other projects, mean that we now have potentially a nuclear construction and reconstruction program in the range of $100 billion. That would make it the largest nuclear construction program that I can think of in North America or Europe. And a legacy of the wind government, something called the Fair Hydro Plan, we are also subsidizing electricity rates from general revenues to the tune of $7.3 billion a year. That's money that would otherwise be going on healthcare and education. We come back to that later. The overall results with the pathway that has been chosen is a combination of embedding rising costs, particularly with the emphasis on nuclear, given the cost of both refurbished plants, which is around 14 cents per kilowatt hour. And then for new build, looking at this globally, the numbers seem to be settling somewhere in the mid-20s. This is the levelized electricity cost. So delivered electricity, including capital costs. So this is potentially a very, very expensive pathway. As I mentioned before, you can see here on the right, this almost vertical rise in greenhouse gas emissions as the gas plants are ramped up to run through the 2030s. And indeed, by some of the projections from the ISO, that ramp continues through the 2040s. Now, there has been considerable thought given to, are there alternative pathways for Ontario around electricity? Indeed, probably that question has been more studied in Ontario than anywhere else in Canada. And we've had very interesting work done by the Atmospheric Fund, looking at, well, can you decarbonize without gas and without new build nuclear or the Pickering refurbishment by 2035, to which the answer was yes, and do so more cheaply. The IESO itself has done very interesting work on distributed energy resources, and the conclusion there from Dunsky and Power Advisory was that there was no need for new gas and there's no need to ramp up the existing gas, that those requirements can be met through DER development. The David Suzuki Foundation has done work looking at a net zero pathway that does not involve gas or nuclear. It's very interesting work there, using models which, to my mind, are in many ways more sophisticated than the ones that the ISO uses. And there's also, this was an older one, there's now a newer energy efficiency potential study as well, which suggests a lot is both technically feasible and economic and achievable on the efficiency side. There are deepening challenges around the pathway the province has taken. The nuclear expansion project would not involve CANDUs. They would involve some new, and in case of Bruce, unknown reactor technologies around which the costs are essentially unknown. But the record of delay and massive cost overruns on new build nuclear projects, the handful that did emerge from the previous nuclear renaissance is continuing and does not inspire confidence. There's questions, how would this be financed? The only actual financing at the moment is the Federal Infrastructure Bank has given $1 billion for one reactor at Darlington. There are questions about waste fuel management and other things that arise out of this as well. And of course, behind this, though, the rationale for all of this and this expectation of demand growth is decarbonization, but the province has no meaningful climate strategy and no decarbonization strategy. Indeed, quite the opposite. The province is engaged in efforts to expand the gas grid for space heating. They're actually overruling the Ontario Energy Board on that. They want to build the 413 highway, which basically facilitates automobile travel, and at the moment, most of it fossil-based because we have no strategy around electrification of transportation in Ontario either. Loads are becoming increasingly dynamic, not well served by inflexible assets like nuclear. And there are competing, converging technological revolutions going on around renewables, storage, smart grids, distributed resources, and microgrids that the rest of the world is moving in other directions very, very quickly. The winners in this regime, if we're looking at it from a governance perspective, clearly Ontario Power Generation. In many ways, Ontario Hydro's monopoly is being rebuilt, especially when you consider that OPG is also now a major gas plant operator, as well as nuclear and hydro. And one does have to think, well, last time that happened, it didn't end well. Bruce Power obviously doing very, very well as well. These are basically institutionally embedded incumbents. The federal role in this is uncertain at this stage. There were proposals for a clean electricity regulation and aiming for a 2035 net zero grid. Although in practice, even in the original proposal, existing gas plants would have run out potentially into the 2040s at least. And now there's been a very significant back down from the federal government. So where the clean electricity regulations are going is a good question. So I've argued elsewhere, what we've ended up with is a kind of inverted approach to planning. There is no planning process, but what you've got here is a plan from the province that puts the high risk, high cost, high impact options first, nuclear and gas, and pretty much leaves everything else, demand side, distributed resources, renewables, interprovincial, interties, pretty marginalized relative to those two components. And in a sustainability context, one might argue you'd do the opposite, which you'd put your lowest cost and risk options first and your high cost and risk options last, which would tend to suggest you do the conservation demand management things first, distributed resources, renewables and storage, interties, particularly with Quebec, although the situation with Quebec is becoming more complicated. One would want to avoid natural gas expansion to the greatest extent possible, both in terms of construction, but also in the role of the existing gas plants. To some degree, we are stuck with some of the nuclear refurbishments. I don't think you could undo the Bruce one at this stage, and Darlington is more and more committed too. But I would tend to argue that attempting new build nuclear should probably be the option of last resort when all of these other things have been exhausted. I think I'm going to finish there because the time is up anyway. I will draw attention to the sort of framework around this, which is from a book that we published with UBC Press in the fall, Sustainable Energy Transitions in Canada. It's an edited volume, and it is available open access on the UBC Press website, and UBC Press would not have forgiven me had I not put the plug in. So I think that's good for me. And I'll turn it back to Allison. I understand we're going to go into the Q&A section at this stage. There we go.
Yes, that is our plan. We'll go into the Q&A session, but before we go there, I want to thank you very much for a very informative talk, and certainly timely in that, we are acknowledging and celebrating Earth Month. And so thank you for bringing some of your research and content to our communities. It's very much appreciated. To our audiences, it's time for your questions. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. For those of you watching live on Facebook, you're welcome to submit any questions or comments through the comment section for the video. So I'll be looking at the Q&A and seeing what comes in, and they are rolling in. So I'm going to ask the first question, which is, and perhaps Mark, if I can just ask you to stop your screen share, that will
it should be stopped.
It should be stopped. Okay. Oh, it might be my view. Let me just check my view. Yep, there we go. Okay, so James is asking, do you see any promising developments in thinking about how resource planning should be conducted in Ontario?
Good question. It depends on how we ask. If we're thinking about Ontario itself, I think the short answer is no. There is some effort within the IESO, I think, in fairness, to think about efficiency, to think about renewables, and to think about distributed resources. But there is no real planning framework into which those questions can be put. And so this is a problem, because we do have these massive investments being made, which are very, very long-lived and very, very high lock-in effects, which are not subject to any form of external review or assessment. And we need to be very clear, the OEB has no role in looking at this. We look to other jurisdictions, they do have planning processes. Oddly enough, I've been following Manitoba, of all places, which has taken a very interesting approach in terms of trying to recognize the uncertainties about how decarbonization may actually unfold, and to think about which way things may go, and to try and identify the variables that would sort of be determinative in terms of where things are going to play out. I think that's a very interesting model. It's a million miles from where we are in Ontario, I must admit. On the other hand, we do continue to have the local distribution utilities, the Toronto Hydros and the Electras, continue to be sources of innovation and want to do more on particularly distributed resources. But again, their role is being very marginalized. This is a decision-making process, as I hinted at, which is being dominated by the institutionally embedded incumbents, read Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power. So I think we're in this odd position. We've got a whole range of possibilities that have been put in front of us by a variety of different folks. We've probably done more work on this in Ontario than anywhere else in Canada, but there is no window for the uptakes. And so this is very problematic.
Thank you for that. The next question that I'd like to ask is coming in from Afshin, who asks, can you please comment on SMR technology, and also comment on the baseload nature of nuclear versus intermittent renewables?
On SMRs, that's a different talk, but the fundamental problem is this existential challenge of non-existence. This is an area where we need to separate the sales pitches from reality. And the reality is that these things don't exist, at least in anything like the kind of applications that are being talked about. They only exist as designs. And indeed, they seem to be moving further away from the possibility of realization, with the failure of the New Scale initiative, which was sort of a flagship SMR project, both on technical and economic grounds, this looks less and less viable. I mean, there's just no other way to put it. The economics are not looking good. There are technical questions being raised. So I think it's being massively oversold. I'm trying to remember the second half of the question. Sorry, Alice, maybe help me out there.
Second half of the question was also comment on the baseload nature of nuclear versus
baseline.
intermittent renewables.
Yeah, well, the problems that we've had there is that in fact in Ontario we've had the problem of surplus baseload generation, which is when we can't turn the nuclear plants down enough, and we've actually had to have people take electricity off our hands at a cost to us. Where we're getting increasingly with the converging technological revolutions, I would argue, around renewables, storage, and smart grids is the ability to manage those kinds of distributed resources much more effectively. And we're already seeing high levels of variable renewable energy integration into systems in Europe and the United States as well. The other consideration here is that loads, as we electrify, are becoming more dynamic. That they're not going to be the simple flat line that a baseload model serves well. They're going to be much more up and downy as well. And in some cases in two ways, because with lots of discussions around things like, can we use parked fleets of electric vehicles, which of course have built-in high capacity batteries as grid storage assets and things like that. So I'm kind of thinking, as the technologies are evolving, the sort of baseload notion that grounded nuclear in the past, I'm not sure applies in the same kind of way. That what happens at the distribution level is going to become much more complex. But then as the IESO's work on DERs made clear, the capacity to manage that is also getting a lot better. So I'm thinking we're kind of evolving forward here. Now that said, in Ontario, we're going to be stuck with Bruce for another generation, assuming the refurbishments are completed. So we're probably not in a nuclear phase out in this round kind of situation in Ontario. We're still probably going to have some of that no matter what. The question is how much, and do we really want to take the risk on expansion when we've had quite good modeling from multiple sources who are more or less saying we don't need to go there. We don't need to try new build, and we don't need to try and do a fixer-upper on Pickering B.
Thank you. The questions are rolling in, so I'll just read the next one that comes in. It says, you didn't mention the plan for 5,000 megawatts of new renewables. Is that because the RFP hasn't gone out yet?
I actually did.
Oh, you did. Okay, we just misheard.
Yeah, there is a slide in there, and I did mention that as the sort of at the end of last year. We have not seen the RFP for renewables yet, so we don't really know how this is going to work. And the fact remains, though, that the overwhelming focus is on nuclear and on gas. And the efforts on DERs and on the demand side remain feeble. So yes, the reopening of the door on renewables is good and welcome. It's a reversal from 5 years ago when we were ripping wind turbines out of the ground, but a little bit too little at this stage if we are serious about, if you look at the modeling that Taft did and that Suzuki did and others, we're going to need a lot more renewables if we're serious about a net zero grid by 2035 and ramping down the role of gas. So it's there. We don't know how it's going to play out, but we also have to remember it was accompanied by this double down on the nuclear side as well, with the Pickering B announcement. So where this is going again is a big question. It goes back to this other question, that there is no planning framework and there is no oversight. And so it's not clear, does the reintroduction of renewables change the trajectory overall? Does this mean we don't need some of the nuclear new build, for example? And the problem is we have no framework and no process within which those questions can be asked. And that's a serious problem. I mean, we're flying on a make it up as we go along kind of approach. And I'm not sure that's optimal either from an environmental perspective or a financial perspective at this stage.
Thanks for that. And I think that actually answered a few questions that were in. Eva had asked, why are renewables not winning the day? And I think you just spoke to that. And Janice also asked a question about, why are the government so supportive of nuclear when there can be so many risks? So I think you spoke to those, just that. So I'm going to move forward on some of the questions. So talk about Mike's question about storage.
Yeah.
Mike asks, how extensive are plans for energy storage in both the short term and long term?
It's interesting. Ontario has been pursuing some grid scale storage as sort of a standalone asset, which is interesting. At least in my mind, it's been on the one hand, a positive development that it's sort of opening the door to new technological developments around storage, which again is one of these areas where we're seeing sort of a technological revolution in process in terms of cost and performance. It wasn't entirely clear what IESO's notion of what role that was going to play because the door was closed on intermittent renewables. And the obvious answer would be, well, you would be combining the storage with the renewables to give you a more smooth supply curve. So we're kind of still waiting to see what the thinking is in terms of where that's really going to fit. And again, the absence of a planning framework complicates this. Storage can play roles in other ways as well. It's becoming more common to combine renewable facilities with storage capacity right on site, solar or wind. So again, you get a higher degree of dispatchability and reliability. You can also help with ramping up and down. And then, of course, storage is going to be central to distributed energy resource development, which is basically sort of wiring together building level or facility level, rooftop solar, wind, maybe building level storage, possibly fleets of parked EVs, again, into more reliable, a useful and reliable resource. Unfortunately, our DER development pathway in Ontario seems somewhat stalled, as I said, sort of relegated to the sandbox, as opposed to more mainstream, which we are seeing in the US. So again, we're seeing some opening on the technological front on storage and renewables, but it's sort of tentative, and then where it fits within the overall decision-making and planning framework is essentially an unknown, because we don't have a decision-making and planning framework. This is being made up on a seat of the pants kind of basis, and directives come out of the minister's office saying do this or that. But there's no planning framework, and there's no process where we ask questions in front of a regulator. Does this make sense technologically? Does it make sense economically? Does it make sense environmentally? And that, I think, remains a major problem in terms of where we are.
You're right. And I think that speaks to some of the questions coming in. And so though there isn't sort of that framework and oversight, I'll just sort of ask the question that is that's in the Q&A by Martin, and he's asking, if new electric vehicles and heat pumps are powered by new natural gas electricity instead of renewables, storage and conservation, which of these two choices actually makes ecological sense?
this is becoming a complicated question. Um, and indeed, within the university, I don't think I'm revealing anything too much. We're having this debate ourselves about the role of the cogeneration plant and which is gas fired, and does it make sense to electrify our hot water and steam operations if the electricity from the grid we'd be doing that with is going to be gas fired. And all I can say is we're in the midst of that analysis. But the question is I think it's an emerging one in Ontario that people are only just beginning to grasp that um, we want to electrify transportation, we want to electrify space heating and cooling with heat pumps, but the equation gets a lot more complicated if the electricity that's being used for those purposes is gas-fired, which certainly looks like it's going to be the case out well into the 2030s and possibly beyond. That as I say, the marginal supply in Ontario is gas, and all I can say is this is problematic from an electrification perspective, that we assume, and indeed the province itself is out there talking about electrification in terms of clean electricity. I think I mean low carbon, and that's not the case. And so the carbon balance gets a lot more complicated if that electricity is coming from a fossil fuel fired source. I can't give you a definitive answer. I've not done the analysis. I say we're trying to figure out, for the university's own energy decision-making purposes, the answer to that question. And what then makes the most sense from a global carbon perspective? What is actually the lower carbon pathway to take in that circumstance? But this is hugely problematic because we see electrification of transportation and space heating and cooling is essential from a climate perspective. Transportation and buildings are two areas in Ontario where we're seeing growth in greenhouse gas emissions. So we have to get at that. On the buildings, the conservation and demand management side, so building shell, operational, that is all good. We need to do that regardless of what pathway we're taking. That's the no regrets option. We may be able to deal with some of the electrification of transportation with DERs at the distribution grid level. But these are becoming questions we're going to have to think about, as the gas curve in Ontario at the moment is essentially vertical in terms of the growth of emissions, and this is very problematic. This is the reason numerous sort of actors have been trying to think about what is a pathway for Ontario that does not look like that.
Thanks. Thank you for that. And there are a number of questions coming in about, the government and some of the sort of background education and choices they're making. I won't read them all out, but there's curiosity about the level of science background of some of our ministers. And someone is also asking, are there any plans, or do we know of any plans to start developing more of an oversight framework in the future? Is there political will for it? And there's some examples of things that are happening in other parts of the world. Switzerland, sharing with Quebec is mentioned. Any comments on those pieces?
A number of things in there. At the moment, there seems to be there's been mutterings about some form of planning framework. There was actually a task force set up that reported a little while ago on this. But doesn't seem to be going anywhere. That sort of was asking this question, well, what would an appropriate planning framework and oversight framework look like? And I think where we seem to be ending up is a situation where certain choices are going to be locked in, particularly on the nuclear side, before any kind of planning framework can be established. I mean, that may well be a conscious strategy on the part of OPG and Bruce Power. I'll be as blunt as that. That by the time we get to the point of having a planning framework, there won't be very much left to plan. So that is a distinct problem. I'm surprised the extent to which the electrification task force's report just fell into a black hole. Even though the people involved, I think some of them were very serious people. The relation with Quebec is a different set of questions. Monsieur Legault, the Premier Minister of Quebec, made repeated overtures to Mr. Ford, offering to enter into an arrangement, which were completely rebuffed. Quebec now does seem more and more on its own pathway, although there may be some margin in terms of regional enterprise ties still. But that is problematic, because the East-West interties would be very helpful. They're helpful in other contexts too. The Manitoba, Saskatchewan, how are you going to decarbonize in Saskatchewan? We had a PhD student work on that, and the answer, lots of wind and solar in Saskatchewan, but you need storage, and Saskatchewan has no storage, but you do in Manitoba. And there's been discussions about an Alberta-BC relationship. There's discussions about the Atlantic Loop, seeing as we're stuck with Muskrat Falls in Newfoundland, in Atlantic Canada, but we've had trouble moving this forward. And again, if you look at all of the modeling that's been done for Ontario, even the stuff from the ISO assumes some relationship with Quebec. And there is some movement there, but not as much as it could have been. And I think there is concern we may have missed a chunk of the window with Quebec, that when they offered, we turned our backs on them. And now Quebec is going down potentially different pathways. Although I don't think the door is completely closed. We've worked quite closely with colleagues at HEC, Université de Montréal, on these questions, but it's a different space from where we were just a couple of years ago, unfortunately. In terms of governance models, I mean, what we have in Ontario is by interjurisdictional standards bizarre. That we don't have effective oversight of the planning process by some sort of utilities commission that has some kind of mandate to look at what's going on and whether it makes sense. Even in Newfoundland, there was the Public Utilities Commission that did look at Muskrat Falls, said don't do it, didn't matter. This is a problem that we have to understand how much of an outlier we have become in terms of how this is working relative to other jurisdictions. I mean, everywhere else, there's some kind of oversight and some role of a regulator. You can't just have fiats coming out of the minister's office saying this is what we're going to do, which is essentially the way this is working at the moment. So it becomes a function of who has access. And again, I've hypothesized, we're almost back to where we were in the 1960s with Ontario Hydro and sort of the back door into the Premier's office and all the jokes about, well, does Ontario Hydro, does the government of Ontario run Ontario Hydro, or does Ontario Hydro run the government of Ontario? And I think the same question might now be out there about OPG, which is the unquestionable winner in the pathway that's being taken here. And we saw where that landed in terms of the massive debt, everything else. I'm not sure we want to go back there, but I think that's that, to the extent to which we have a governance model that's defining what's happening here. I think that's it.
Thank you. we still have several questions in the Q&A area. So I'm going to ask our guests to kindly not send any more questions because we will try to get through a few of these, but we might not have time to add more. Certainly a wonderful discussion, and we're very grateful to you, Professor Winfield, and to our guests for their interaction. So I'll ask Gary's question, which is maybe a little more hopeful. Gary asks, can a small renewable producer that can locally use the energy produced for the most part have an easy access to sell excess to the grid, as was the case through the FIT program?
Um, at the moment, the short answer seems to be not really. There's a certain amount of net metering allowed, but that's very, very different from the feed-in tariff program that existed under the Clean Energy Act. So it is hard for renewable energy co-ops or similar types of operations. I mean, they were the primary victims of the massacre that happened in 2018 of the renewable projects. This is where these questions around distributed resources become significant, because if there could be a relationship with the distributors, the Toronto Hydros, the Electras, the Ottawa Hydros, that might be the way in. This is what they're advocating for, and indeed, it's sort of partially tied up with the distributed energy resource conversation. The problem remains that the overall framework for the market, such as we have, constrains their ability to play that role of an aggregator of distributed resources, which could then interact with the centralized grid and say, well, we can offer you this much resource, or indeed we don't need so much from the grid, because we have all of these distributed sort of sources that we're managing inside our distribution system. And that can include fleets of parked electric vehicles and things like that. So, as intellectually and indeed in other places, the models exist. In Ontario, at the moment, I regret to say the door seems to be mostly closed. And I wish I had a more hopeful answer. But Ontario in this current framework has been described as an innovation wasteland. That we are doubling down on certain existing technologies, nuclear and rebuilding CANDUs and gas, and a little bit of storage, but pretty much everything else is pretty marginalized when you think of it that way. Is there just isn't room for much else, and indeed there are concerns that the risk of an overbuild, and it's going to be the long high cost, high risk assets, as we've already seen, renewables, distributed resources, energy efficiency, which gets thrown over the side in that scenario. If we find ourselves back into a surplus, if we find electrification doesn't play out the way we think it might, because there still could be an awful lot of behind the meter activity in the electrification process that again would not translate into bulk grid demand. That's a very significant point of risk, especially if the cost for bulk grid electricity supply goes up. You're going to have a lot of actors start to say it makes more sense for us to do stuff behind the meter, to do self-generation, to do DERs on site. You get into very, very complicated dynamics if that starts to happen. But I think there's a real possibility you would start to see it informally as a response to the increasing embedded costs in the grid.
And then maybe we'll end with this last question, given that it's a question about the demand for electricity that we can expect. And I'll read Gail's question. Gail asks, what forecasts for demand for electricity do you think are dependable? Will it be double, triple over the next generation? So we've heard the problems, but what do we think we need?
I think it's a good question. I mean, double is sort of thrown around in some of the analysis. The big questions in my mind are how much of that needs or will materialize as bulk grid demand. The planning assumptions the province is operating on, and indeed a good deal of the conversations I've seen around this, assume that yes, we electrify space heating, we electrify transportation. Yes, we're definitely going to see large increase in demand. But whether that happens in a way that translates into bulk grid demand, the kind of stuff that's served by big gas and nuclear plants, I think is very much an open question. We have not optimized or anything near optimized the potential on the demand side in terms of building energy efficiency and things like that. There's huge potentials there because we haven't done very much. And then in light of the previous question, this question of if grid electricity becomes very expensive, which is basically the pathway we're on, how much of that electrification will happen behind the meter and at the distribution level through distributed resources and people putting rooftop solar and combining it with building or house level storage capacity and wiring that together into microgrids and industrial facilities doing similar sorts of things. That's an unknown at this stage. But the technological forces in some ways are in favor of those pathways as we sort of have these converging, declines in costs around storage, around renewables, as the grid management capacities become more and more sophisticated, more and more able to manage those kinds of resources. Those possibilities become more and more real. And indeed, in Ontario, we have the LDCs, the local distribution utilities, who are sort of putting their hands up and saying, we would be very happy to be the facilitators of that sort of thing. So it's in my mind, it's a high area of uncertainty, which again, in my mind, makes this massive investment in the most inflexible and long-lived option, large nuclear, and SMRs I don't regard as particularly viable at this stage. It's 100 billion on big nuclear, is an enormously high-risk pathway because electrification is very unlikely to play out the way you think it will, given the pace of technological change. What the 2040s are really going to look like is a good question. And again, going back to Manitoba, part of their approach was to think about this in much shorter time frame increments and to think about, what are the inflection points? What tells us which way things are going to go and which way should we go? And the sort of pathway the province is taking essentially obviates those kinds of options. We're going to be stuck with something 20 to 30 years from now, which may or may not be very well configured for what we actually need. And that's a very ugly scene. We know what that looks like. That's what happened to Ontario Hydro. And I don't think we want to repeat that. And I'm not sure the province can afford to repeat that, given the scale of the capital commitments that are being made. So that would be my response there is I think, yes, need for electricity will go up. What form that takes and what the best way to meet those needs, I think, remains an open question. And we should be very careful about high lock-in pathways that are making very, very shaky assumptions about what will happen, given the economic dimensions and the technological pace of technological change, which is happening.
Thank you. You know, I'm not a scholar in this area and have learned so much here. I want to conclude actually with my own question. You know, as someone who's not a scholar in this area and who's, you know, a mom of teenagers, working a job and living the life, is there anything that, you know, that we could and should be doing?
I think there's many things. Um, uh, there are programs for household energy efficiency, for starters, and to have home energy efficiency audits done. We did that on our house and revealed all kinds of cost-effective ways of reducing our energy demand. And that's very much a no regrets option. Um, One can be thinking about, I mean, we've talked about the complications of electrifying transportation and space heating. But again, there are no regret options there too. I mean, obviously transit is more efficient no matter what you do. Walking and biking is better still, wherever you can. The climate doesn't always agree with that possibility. Um, I think people need to look at the economics of moving to EVs, and be looking at the economics of moving towards heat pumps. Uh, but we are, at the same time, we need to be making our voices heard that the trajectory that the province is on is not okay. And I think that's also crucial. Um, I would look at the work that the Ontario Clean Air Alliance is doing around the gas question, and that many municipalities are now joining as well. The City of Toronto, Mayor Chow is asking questions about the expansion of the Portland's gas plant, which is absolutely part of this whole conversation. So we need to be thinking of what can we do at a household level, but we also need to be making our voices heard in this conversation, and saying to MPPs that the pathway we're on, people need to make their own choices, but I would argue is not necessarily the one we want to be on or need to be on, and it is creating this huge complication around the question of electrification in this province.
Wonderful. Dr. Winfield, thank you so much for being here, sharing somewhat sombering, but also hopeful research and giving us a better understanding of the province that we're living in and the world we're living in. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. Thank you.
We're very, very, very happy to chat with you, and very, very grateful for all the questions that we got.
Awesome. Okay, so at this point, Dr. Winfield, you can turn off your video and I'll just finish up the webinar. For our audience here, we have one more poll question for you, which is, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following the discussion? So that should pop up on your screen right now. And if you could just let us know, I know for me, it certainly has improved. Thank you very much. What's coming next in the Scholars Hub? We will be back on Wednesday, May 8th at noon. The lecture will be titled Selfie Harm, the Effects of Social Media on Body Image with Jennifer Mills, professor in the Faculty of Health and Director of Clinical Training and Clinical Psychology graduate program. Selfie Harm, oh my gosh, that anyone with teenagers, you don't want to miss this one. I know I'll be there. To register for it and learn about any of our other upcoming sessions, please visit, as always, yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Thank you all so very much for your questions, for your engagement, for caring, and I wish you a beautiful rest of your day. Thank you and be well.